For more on this breaking news, let's bring in Thomas Mockaitis. He's a professor of history at DePaul University in Chicago. He's also an expert in terrorism, insurgency, and peace operations. Thomas, thank you so much for joining us. What are your thoughts? Police are calling this a terror situation. Does this look like ISIL?
Well, it certainly is suggestive of that, given the pattern of events we've seen over the last 6 to 8 months. Your reporter is absolutely right. This is a pattern we're seeing. We saw attacks on the Westgate Mall in Nairobi a couple of years ago. We saw the recent attack in Nice, France, the attack on the train. What the terrorists have learned is it's getting harder and harder to take out hardened targets, government buildings, airports, and so on. But crowds and venues and crowded environments like shopping malls are very, very tempting targets. And given the pattern of attacks over the last half year in Europe, this is highly suggestive of that.
Well, let's talk about that, because just earlier, a few days ago, we saw that axe attack connected to ISIL near Würzburg on a train. Could this be part of a larger threat in Germany, in Europe, something more coordinated now?
Well, that's the hardest thing to figure out, because the axe attack is indicative of what we refer to as lone wolf terrorism, but it's a different kind of lone wolf terrorism, not the lunatic Ted Kaczynski kind, but individuals who are latching on to ISIS ideology for whatever reason, and even though they themselves do not take direction from the parent organization, their fellow travelers, and ISIS will then baptize or bless their events and say, oh, yes, of course, they're fighting for us and so on. The train attack does not look like that. This one could very well be, especially if it's multiple shooters at multiple locations. But I want to caution people that when the Dallas shooting happened, the initial reports suggested 3 shooters. We now realize that the individual was very well trained and just knew how to shoot and move, which is what good snipers will do. So it's hard to get a fix. You'll get multiple people reporting seeing the same person, and that will then come down as multiple shooters. Same with the victims. The body count will be very unreliable for some time.
Thomas, Jim Spellman here in Washington, D.C. How do authorities stop and prevent attacks against soft targets like malls or, a sidewalk in Nice when there's little planning, little intelligence for them to intercept in the first place?
Well, I think in the Nice case, I'm a bit concerned that we've had situations in Chicago where we've actually knowing there would be demonstrations, we did try to close off roads and at least prevent, what we call a catastrophic attack, which is what Nice was. A truck being able to drive down a crowded thoroughfare like that was being used by pedestrians. That can be, if not prevented, decreasing the likelihood of it. Individual shooters who don't mind dying, operating with small arms and a lot of magazines are almost impossible to stop. You can rely on surveillance cameras. You can also that will help you investigate, and that won't necessarily prevent. You can put people undercover and so on. But the thing is, if you want to move around in a free, open society, you're going to have to accept a certain level of risk.
With the difficulty of obtaining weapons in Europe, what does this say about coordination of behind a larger organization? With the Nice attack, they found grenades, guns in the back of that truck. Obviously, in the case that we're seeing with Germany, if it is in fact connected to ISIL, these people were able to get automatic weapons.
Well, yeah, I think that is in Europe. In the U.S., I would say that doesn't mean anything. It's so easy to get weapons. In Europe, you're absolutely right. There's far tighter gun control. Many of the Nice things turned out to be fake weapons too, which has raised concern about the individual. Whether the individual really was nothing more than somebody who's disturbed. But Europe has a lot of territory, a lot of open borders. So coming under a lot of political discussion right now. The Schengen Agreement covers much of Europe, so you could smuggle things over borders. There's a lot of weapons still floating around in the old Soviet Union. Could they make their way westward without too much difficulty? Probably. There's a lot of weapons left over in the Balkans from the conflicts there. It's just not that hard given the interconnectedness and the trade and so on. And the small size of these weapons, it's not as hard to move them around as people might imagine.
What needs to happen with intelligence agencies within these countries and coordinating with other intelligence across Europe to perhaps combat these threats from terrorists?
Well, the thing about intelligence is people have this mistaken notion that intelligence is like some sort of Easter egg hunt. You find the golden egg and you get the prize. You find that bit of information, it tells you exactly when and where the terrorists are going to strike. What you're more likely to get is what's called strategic warning. What that indicates is something is afoot, that we expect within a certain time frame an increased likelihood of attack. But that doesn't mean we have a very precise picture of when and where it will take place. And when it comes to individuals like the young man on the train, if my assumption here is correct, that he was something of a random actor or a lone wolf, the intelligence is not going to help you much at all. There, what you need is to look at security, look at trained passengers, and so on. And that's a harder thing to stop. But on the other hand, it's far less lethal than somebody or several people with, light automatic weapons and multiple round clips going in and on a shooting rampage.
Thomas, Jim Spellman again. So if the front line in the war against ISIL, we don't know who's behind this attack, but if the front line in this war is not Syria or Iraq, but is a nightclub in Orlando, a shopping mall in Paris, do we need to really rethink from the ground up how intelligence and counterterrorism operations work in the West?
The thing I would take issue with is there really isn't a front line. This is a multidimensional conflict. And I think you can make a pretty good case that the increase in attacks in Europe and the United States actually correlate with increasing pressure on ISIS in its homeland. That the coalition is having success. It's taking away territory. It's diminishing its economic resources. It's taking out its leaders, degrading its organization, and that's causing it to lash out farther afield. Now, that's the good news. The bad news, of course, is the network dimension of the terrorist cell dimension becomes more prominent. And, for all of the fighters that have gone to Syria, many have now cycled back into Europe and are in a position, as al-Qaeda did before them, to carry out attacks of this nature. I don't know that rethink is exactly it. We're constantly rethinking it. I think the added dimension is now we need to look at the farther abroad as a major focus of ISIS activity. And, intelligence sharing has to occur internationally, but within countries. I mean, in Brussels, we know that one of the breakdowns was that there were too many law enforcement organizations that didn't have terribly good coordination.
All right, Thomas Mockaitis, thank you so much for joining us.